Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today for this bonus episode, a summer episode before the beginning of the second season, your guest is George, or Yorgos, Tso. George is an anthropologist, and his work investigates the socio-cultural relations between Christian communities in Jerusalem with a particular focus on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. George is part of the international community of the Holy Sepulchre, ICOHS, which has been created to provide practical support for Christian communities in the Holy Land. George also recently was appointed a deacon by the Greek Orthodox Church in the UK. Congratulations, George. And today we'll talk about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, its history, but more importantly, of the relationship between the clergy and the people within the church itself. George, welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged.
Thank you, Roberto. I'm a fan of the series, so thanks very much for the invitation.
Thank you. Good to hear that. George, first question. What is your Jerusalem? In other words, as I was asked to my guest, what is your connection with the city?
Jerusalem figured very sort of vividly in my family growing up as the holy city, very much dictated by the religious sort of dimension of the city. As it is customary for Orthodox Greeks and other Christians, of course, people travel to the Holy Land as part of a pilgrimage. However, although family members went to Jerusalem, I never joined them, so I never followed them. My connection with Jerusalem starts basically from 2014, when I embarked on PhD research in anthropology, looking at life in a major shrine of Christianity, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And it all started 2 years earlier, at the end of my master's program, when I was writing my dissertation on the use of religious items in religion, the use of items, artifacts in Christianity. And my brother, who had just returned from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, walked in the room saying, George, as an anthropologist, you should definitely go to Jerusalem and look at the behavior of religious people there. Faith is everywhere. It's fascinating. And I remember spending the rest of the day looking up, online, researching more about Jerusalem and potential future research there. So this eventually led me to study the social and cultural relations of, custodians in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but also the lay Christians outside in the neighborhood of the old city, how they interact, and if there are any differences with people in the institutions. And as being an anthropologist, I'm interested in understanding people's practices, what people do, how they do things, and if the way they do things actually tells us anything about how they relate to others. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre offers a unique opportunity because it is a unique juncture between ancient Christian communities and demonstrates the diversity and plurality of Christianity. I'm sure you know that there's 6 different ancient Christian denominations in the church, and they all worship side by side. The Greek Orthodox, they're called Greeks. The Roman Catholics, they have the Franciscan Custodia, and they're called Latins. and also the Armenian Orthodox. They have the Armenian Brotherhood of St. James. They're called locally Armenians. The major communities, but also the Oriental Orthodox, the Copts, the Syriacs, and the Ethiopian that live outside on the roof of the church. So from an ethnographic point of view, it's an amazing place to be doing research. So that's how I'm connected to the city. I went there to do research, and I was lucky to get the funding from the British Academy, which allowed me to stay there for almost 2 years.
I think your brother was right. That's definitely the work of an anthropologist, to take some time and observe people's behavior over there. I want to ask you something. You obviously, in your work, you refer to people, but we also have to refer to the building. And I was wondering if you can give us a sense of what is the Holy Sepulchre. I mean, many may know about it, but in time I learned that sometimes places are just recognized by a name, but people don't know necessarily much about the building itself, the history behind it, and what it represents for Christians, but not only for Christians.
So, of course, yeah, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is basically a big church complex that contains the sites that most Christians believe that are the sites of crucifixion and burial of Jesus of Nazareth, which is the leader of Christianity. So people hear about this place in the gospel when they go to the church, and at some point in their life, they will make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to connect with these places and see for themselves those places that, the leader of Christianity walked and lived and preached and, died and resurrected. So it's a big church complex, and within the church, there's different sacred localities, different shrines. And the custodians, the communities that live in the church, so the Greek Orthodox, the Catholics, the Armenians, and the Oriental Orthodox, they all have rights of possession and usage of those shrines, the sacred localities. So it's one big place that has smaller, very kind of different places within it.
I wanted to ask you something about not just the building, but also the different ways people, Christians or belonging to different denominations, look at the church. I'm not an expert on Christianity. I'm not an expert on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but my impression is that when Christians visit the church, they do behave differently according to what may be their sort of belonging to, to what church they may belong to. Is that a correct assessment?
Thank you, Robert. That's an interesting question. When pilgrims arrive in Jerusalem, they are faced with a brutal reality, because they know these places through their imagination from what they've been hearing in the gospel or whatever they've saw online. But as other people in anthropology, the studied pilgrims, and other academics and scholars have mentioned, there is a kind of the encounter with the reality is sometimes harsh. For example, a lot of people read in the Gospels, in the Bible, that the site of crucifixion, the Golgotha, is on a hill. So when they arrive in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they try to find that hill, which is probably somewhere outside. However, the hill, which it's basically within the church complex. So, yeah, so this is the side, the material side of the whole thing. But also they encounter other Christians that they don't really know. And this is especially seen with Protestant Christians that arrive in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and they witness another kind of Christianity. They witness people that have long beards and crosses, and they are dressed in various different, clothing, and they are also Christian as well. So, if I understand your question correctly, it's a very diverse place, and people, while they are in a highly sort of an emotionally charged situation where they encounter the holy places for them, they also have to sort of, reconcile with the fact that other Christians are also there, part of it.
Yeah, and I was wondering about this relationship, which is also part of your work. So, how do the different Christian groups interact with each other within the Holy Sepulchre? I mean, we know that there is something called the status quo of the holy places, which some sort of dictates what can be done within the space. But I'm interested about the relationship between people, not just in relation to the building itself.
So in the church, diverse Christian faiths, they come into contact via their custodian groups in various ways. So you can see Orthodox priests, processing from one shrine to the other. You can see Catholic pilgrims arriving with their own, group, Russian pilgrims, or Ethiopian women dressed in their own prayer shawls. You can see the Greek monks standing in front of the holy of the Edicule, the little the chapel enclosing the tomb of Jesus. So this happens at once. They attend various types of service and they process around shrines. Now, denominational boundaries between the custodians, they're firmly maintained from the status quo. Status quo legislation has very clearly defines who does what, and what shrine belongs to who, belongs in quotation. But this is just a basic agreement. Each of the communities, they have their own extensive notes of how they do things, and sometimes their understanding is different. So relations can become tense. The various Christian communities are famous for the petty squabbling. I'm sure we've all seen Greek monks feuding with Armenian clerics over the cleaning of such and such window. So the coexistence is peaceful, but disputes also happen. Now, my understanding is that people don't fight, they don't fight because of differences, theological differences about who Christ is. I would say, people get tired. It's like a big community. It's different communities, but it's also one big community. And sometimes they do come together as well. This is a separate discussion we can have. But they kind of get tired with each other. We have to consider that about 4,000 or 5,000 tourists and pilgrims are present in the church daily. I mean, that's before the pandemic. And they all, as I said, they are emotionally charged, and they also have demands. They want to understand things. They want to ask questions. And this is only a few people, like a few clerics, that are responsible for those shrines, the same people every day. So you understand, tensions can become, can erupt between them. And I can give you an example if you want me to. So in my research, I'm really interested in the use of objects, as I said. So I took a material sort of stance in understanding how things are done in the church. So in 2015, the Israeli Ministry of Tourism gave permission to Egyptian Christians to travel to Jerusalem. And this is important because up until then, Egyptians could not travel to Israel because of the history of the two countries. So when these people arrived, naturally, and I say naturally because anthropologists working with, in religion, they tend to see that people want to take something back when they go to a shrine. It's something, it is the materiality of the place that you want to, we embed meaning to objects, right? So we want to take something back because it's meaningful. So if you enter the Edicule, there's nothing for you to take, there's just a marble slab and walls and icons, but they're all fixed and there's nothing you can actually take with you. However, there was a pot on the tomb of Jesus that has sand in there, so you can light your candle and you can fix it in the sand. You can stick it in the sand and it stays there. So people wanted to take something back and they couldn't find anything else, so they started taking the sand from the pot. And suddenly you could see like sand everywhere, people trying to put it in their pockets. And you can imagine how furious the monks became, because all of a sudden the place was just full of sand. And this is just an example to give you an understanding of how easily people can get upset. They can just, sometimes it's too much.
I found it fascinating. I didn't know about the sand. I was aware people were trying to get, even pieces of marbles or anything, grating, basically the structure all around. I didn't know about the sandwich. I found it, I guess it's part what you mentioned. People want to bring back something. I'm curious about one behavior that I noticed many times. When you enter the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you bump into what it's called the Stone of Junction, which is this kind of a pinkish stone, which is really at the very entrance. And often you get to see plenty of people, mostly women, I would say, with bags, full of clothing or other items. And my understanding is that they're basically touching that material in order to bring it back home, some sort of looking for a blessing. I was wondering if you know more about it, how that ritual started and what is connected to.
Yes, that's exactly right up my street. So basically what happens there in the Orthodox Christianity, because you would notice that it's mostly Orthodox that do that, or let's say Eastern Christians, and that includes some Catholics as well, but definitely the Copts and the Oriental Orthodox as well. So divine grace, so the grace of God, is imagined, is understood as having two abilities. One is that it can be transferred, right? And it can also be incorporated, right? So incorporability and transferability. So what people do there, they take mostly clothes from a sick relative, and as this is now the marble slab, that Christians believe that the body of their leader, Jesus Christ, was placed there after being taken down from the cross. It's a holy place, so they rub the sick the clothes from the sick relative on there, thinking that the grace of God now is incorporated on this item, and they can take it back and give it to this sick person. They will do that as well with candles or with icons or whatever they have with them that they can take back. So yeah, that's the first. It's quite an interesting experience, because the moment you walk in the church, you see people rubbing things on the marble, and if you haven't seen that before, it's quite a spectacle.
It is indeed, and I've seen people sometimes taken aback, try to understand what's going on. I was wondering, are there other places within the compound that are similar, where people are either trying to get something or bringing something from home and to connect it to the place itself? So you were talking about this concept of transferability, or is that the unique place within the church?
That's one of the shrines. The same happens, and I think the reason for this being one of the shrines is because it's very accessible. The rocks of Golgotha, the site of crucifixion, they are basically enclosed in a glass, so you can't really touch these rocks. And as you said a bit earlier, this has been a tradition for most pilgrims. They would take something back. So that's how the original cave was basically. It was all, the rock was chipped away through the centuries because people would just take a bit of a rock with them. So that's when the Crusaders placed the marble slab, and then on top of that slab there was another marble slab. A few years ago there was actually an excavation. I don't know if you followed. There was a research done from the University of Athens and other universities. So this is the most accessible place. That's why people do it there. They do other things as well. I've seen a lot of different things. One is one that I'm familiar with from the Orthodox side of things is people take candles and they light them from the fire placed on the tube of Jesus, and then they blow them and they take these candles with them. So they take them back home, and when there's a problem, at the time of need, they light them again and they pray. And that's also similar to the Holy Fire, which is a big feast for Jerusalem's Christianity. People light their candlesticks and then they take them back home. Again, they keep them in a specific place at home, next to the icons, if they're Orthodox, or other sort of corners, special corners. This is 2 examples I can think of.
I'm very curious about the Holy Fire. I mean, I talked about this with other guests from different perspectives, but allow me to say this. You're an insider. I mean, you also know better the Greek Orthodox community. And I was wondering also through your eyes as an anthropologist, if you can tell us about this ritual, which is very powerful and very connecting for local Christians in Jerusalem, but also in the whole of Palestine.
Yes, the Holy Fire, which is, me personally, I think it's the wrong term. It's actually holy light. Both in Greek and Arabic is a light, is understood as a light. It's not about the fire. And light is a metaphor, in Christianity. Jesus Christ said, I'm the light of the world. There's different kinds of light, the light of transfiguration, the light of Pentecost. It's been used very, very creatively and vividly in Orthodox theology, light. So Christianity comes together really with this feast because all of the different branches all interact in a formal way in this ritual. Normally, it's led by the Orthodox, but all different branches interact. Normally, the Orthodox are very exclusive when it comes to Christianity. So we say we possess the truth, and there's different understandings of the same thing. However, on this particular occasion, different clerics dressed up with their cassocks and the formal vestments interacted. For example, the Oriental Orthodox, so the Copts and the Syriacs, approach the Greek Orthodox Patriarch and take his blessing to partake in the ceremony, and then the Orthodox Patriarch gives them back the light. He lights their candles, and then they spread the light to the people in attendance. So the belief is that. And there's a lot of books actually that talk about this, and with historical accounts, there've been people are witnessing that in the past, that there's a special service for light emanating from the tomb of Christ, that then this light spreads in the people, it's shared between the Christians in attendance. And lately, people have gone to great extents. For example, there's airplanes that come from Greece and from other religious countries to take the light and then take it back home. But theologically, if that's viable, I'm not quite sure. I'm not the right person to ask as well. I think there's also the understanding that in every church there's holy light. Every altar is a tomb of Christ. That's a separate discussion. But it's an amazing feast, and for me, as an anthropologist primarily, I would say it was very interesting to see different people coming together and interacting, especially the clerics. I mean, for the lay Christians, there's no differences. People come together every day, and I'm arguing this in my book that will come back, that will come out later, probably next year. The lay Christians don't say I'm Catholic or I'm Orthodox, and even when you ask them, are you Catholic, are you Orthodox, they basically say we are Christian. So they project a unified identity, sort of. We are Christians, and I think that helps them with their collective standing in the society, because remember, Christians are a minority within a minority. So in the Holy Fire, in the Holy Light ceremony, people come together, and it's really amazing to see.
We are going to take a short break. Thank you for listening, and remember to join our Facebook page, Twitter and Instagram account. If you have a story about Jerusalem that you want to share, or someone that you want me to interview, please get in touch. Enjoy the rest of the show. And since you mentioned your manuscript, I really want to ask you about it. So you have an upcoming book, which is still in the form of a manuscript, and essentially it's investigating the sort of a relationship between the clergy in the Holy Sepulchre. So I was wondering if you can give us a sense of, what's going on in there at a clergy level.
So yeah, what I wanted to see is how boundaries and borders are shaped and maintained and crossed among Christians. That question did not drive my research. When I arrived in Jerusalem, I didn't have a specific question that kind of drive my research. And that was really the advice of my supervisor, Glenn Bowman. That was a great advice. And he basically echoed the words of a famous anthropologist, Malinowski, who said, really, let yourself sort of, let the proceedings and whatever happens in the field drive you. And that's particularly important for an anthropologist, because in anthropology, the person is the primary instrument of research, right? We're doing the research. We're trying to see the world, Jerusalem in this case, through the eyes of our informants, or the people we study, or the people we live with. My access point was the Greek Orthodox community through links and connections I had from Greece, and also because I knew how to carry myself as a believer. So straight ahead, I could establish connections with the custodians. I would say that things have started changing with regards to the relationship between the clerics, and this is because the reality in the Middle East, the reality in the Holy Land, is such that sort of forces people to come together in order to maintain their collective standing. And there are challenges, as you know, with regards to the Holy Sepulchre, with regards to Christians in the Middle East, with regards to Christians in the Holy Land, in both the Israeli and Palestinian societies and the Jordanian societies, to a lesser extent. But as I said, is a minority within a minority. So the different challenges push the institutions, push the leaders to come together and collaborate more, which was not the case in the past, especially during the Ottoman years.
Under the Ottoman era, clergy did not really cooperate much. Of that, I'm sure. I personally collected plenty of files about a specific incident that occurred in 1904, and I've been thinking about really writing about it, where eventually what we had is literally a shooting within the Holy Sepulchre, and people died, monks died. But you talked about the question of borders, and actually that incident, originated because of some borders that were crossed. It was very much about a ladder that someone took, and he shouldn't have done that. But the whole point was crossing borders. Now, I understand that you didn't really research those borders, but I always had the feeling, and maybe because I know the place, that when you walk around the Holy Sepulchres, there are borders, and they might be invisible, but you're actually crossing them. And I was wondering if you had the same feeling in the time you spent in the Holy Sepulchre?
So as I mentioned earlier, different the communities have sort of rights of ownership of different sacred localities in the church. However, some places like the Edicule, the chapel enclosing the tomb of Jesus, are shared between the communities. So although the Greek Orthodox have rights of ownership, as it is called, there are specific times in the day where they have to give leave the Edicule, and the Edicule is free for use by the Franciscans and by the Armenians. And that's where things can become problematic. And that's where borders are crossed, right? Boundaries is more of a theoretical. In my work, I understand boundaries as a theoretical sort of understanding, theoretical sort of concept. Borders is their sort of territorial manifestation, right, on land. So that's where in the chains of control of different shrines that are shared, things can go wrong. Say one community stays longer, or they refuse to leave, or they leave, but they leave someone behind, staying there, and the next one that comes to use the Edicule, they don't like that because they see it as a breach of the status quo agreement. So that's where, that's what borders can be seen as being crossed. Again, there's different feasts in the calendar year. There's layers of complexity, because everything might appear fine, but people have an understanding of where these borders are. And for example, when there's an Orthodox worship, there's a candle that is placed opposite the Edicule. Until that candle is removed, the Armenians that follow cannot approach. So that candle indicates Orthodox control of the Edicule. So you will see around 3 o'clock, for example, in the night, the monk would come and take the candle, and then you'll see the Armenians approaching. So they've got the different sort of signals and different landmarks, let's say, markers perhaps, to indicate control and to indicate to communicate. But they also talk. As I said, the coexistence is mostly peaceful.
I'm curious about the Edicule, because for those who have never been and they may approach for the first time the church itself, I mean, even the Edicule is divided, where essentially 3/4 of the tomb are covered, let's say, or owned by the Greek Orthodox Church, and then you have a smaller side that is controlled by the Copts. And I was wondering if you ever had a chance to observe how people react to that division, but also to see how's the relationship between the two communities who are, controlling the side, but at the same time, one is bigger than the other in very practical terms.
Yeah, the situation is really interesting. So as you said, the Coptic community, the Coptic custodians control what is basically. So if we look at the Edicule as a tomb where a body was placed, the Copts control what would be the part where the head was placed, the head of Jesus, right? So they have that side of the Edicule. And the other one, the 3/4 of the rest of it, is under Orthodox control. So they don't really see each other because they are on the opposite ends, right? So the Coptic community worships on the left end, and then the Orthodox on the other side. There are moments where the communities have to make a circle. They have to make a procession around the Edicule, and that's where it's interesting, because then, if the Orthodox are processing, the Copts have to kind of withdraw a little bit to leave some space for the Orthodox priests to go around. And then I have never seen the Copts going the other side. There might be on another occasion where Orthodox are not around. But they have to make room for each other, really. And I have to say, the conversation I'm having with other academics about the situation in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, sometimes there's recognition that this model of coexistence, although it's complex, and although we see disputes happening, it actually works, because it has allowed very different, diverse Christians to coexist for so long. And the status quo was confirmed internationally. And then really the British helped a lot, because when they took over Jerusalem, they asked the question, they said, how you guys have managed to survive here? They said, we have this kind of agreement. They said, okay, whatever you've been doing, we'll carry on, we will keep. So that, again, it was another important confirmation that allowed the communities to carry on. There are also cases, however, we have to say, where both in the modern states of Jordan and Israel periods, the status quo has not been maintained, or there have been sort of exceptions, let's say. So these are the challenges that I refer to, that the Christian communities have. But mostly, this model of coexistence survives and continues to exist and helps the Christians to live together.
Most of these churches, but not all of them, are connected to countries. The Greek Orthodox Church obviously connected to Greece, but also to Russia and other, let's say, Orthodox countries. Obviously, the Copts mostly with Egypt, the Ethiopians. I wonder if there is some sort of a nationalist international dimension here that also is visible through how people behave and how relate to each other, both in the lay, but also in with the clergy.
That's a great question. Yes, I mean, if we look at this layer of interpretation of the situation in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church is a platform of international agreements between countries. So as you said, yeah, Greece is behind the Orthodox group. However, I have to say, the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate is a local institution. It's very different from the rest of the Catholic and Armenian churches, because it has been there. For example, in the Catholic custodia, you will see the flag of the Vatican, but in the Patriarchate, although sometimes the Greek flag appears, recently people have been arguing that this is really a local institution, because the Patriarchate, the people in the Patriarchate trace their existence to the first Christian communities. But yeah, this is a separate discussion. Essentially, there are agreements between nations, and this contributes to the complexity of the site, but also, I would say, has protected, in a sense, the communities there. But the church is also a local parish, because you have the different custodian groups, and you have people coming over from Greece and Italy, or Brazil, or other people to serve in the custodian groups. But you also have the Orthodox Christians and the Catholic Christians of the city that go in the church. So it's also a local parish. It's also a museum. There's so many international tourists, secular, that just come to the church out of curiosity to see how, what this is and how people interact. So there's different layers of interpretation of the same site.
I'm curious about something, because obviously, this is like the sacred, probably the most sacred place for Christianity, if not for all Christians, but certainly for the largest number. But it's also a place which is visited by Israeli Jews and Arabs, Muslims, and not only Arabs, I mean, just Muslims in general, really. I was wondering, how do they relate to the place? Do they create a connection? Is there some sort of relationship with the Christians, or they just visitors?
Thank you for this. I think what I've experienced when I was there, I spent a lot of hours in the church for about 2 years. I very rarely saw Israelis coming in. They would come, like, if there was a significant event in Jerusalem, and they would perhaps drive from Tel Aviv to attend like a concert or something else, then they would probably at some point fit a visit in the Holy Sepulchre into their schedule. But I would say that mostly you see a lot of Christians, of course, from across the world. You see Muslim people coming in, because Jesus is mentioned in the Quran as a lot of Muslims come in. And of course, they want, primarily they will go to Al-Aqsa and other Muslim sites of the city. But at some point, you will also see them in the church. For the Israelis, I think it's more, Christianity. This is my understanding, right? I might be totally wrong. For my connection with Israelis, I would say Christianity is quite an exotic subject. I'm not quite sure how much people know about Christianity. They know, of course, they know a few things, but I think there's an element of exoticism. It's very different to see a priest, for example, doing what they're doing, going around. Of course, if you trace the roots of Christianity, they're very Jewish, but that's a separate discussion. And I think also it doesn't help, I'm afraid to say, that the narratives from the Israeli tour guides, when it comes to disputes, when it comes to the ladder, there's certain points that are interesting, those are sort of promoted to make the experience interesting for those, for the guiding experience. But for my, when I spend time with Israeli guides, and some of them, of course, those ones I was exposed to in the yard or in other tours that I participated, the narrative is very much about the fights. It's about the ladder. It's about the holy light, the ceremony. The juicy part, the interesting parts.
I think I share your view in a sense that knowing a bit of Israeli society and understanding a little bit of it, it's such a composite and diverse society, which it's hard to generalize. Like I understood that a lot of Russian Jews do often visit because somehow it resonates with them. They may have been Jewish in terms of identity, but really also they're Russians, and so they're very familiar with the narratives of the Holy Sepulchre. But you're absolutely right in a sense that it's exotic and it's little known, and not many actually do visit the place itself. And I found it interesting that many also cannot see the connection between Yeshua Bar Yosef, Jesus, son of Joseph, who was obviously Jewish, and Christianity. I want to ask you something about relations outside the Holy Sepulchre. We talked about before the interview, you also are interested in Christian-Muslim relations. So I was wondering, what is your understanding of, particularly in the contemporary, of this set of relations that outside many see as problematic, and in fact many, particularly in the Western world, see the relationship between Christian and Muslims only in terms of a potential conflict?
Yeah, we have seen this in other parts of the Middle East. I would say that's not the case in Israel. Perhaps, the difference is a different situation in Israel, and also in Palestine as well. There's different interaction. When I with Merav Mak, who we said earlier that Israelis find Christianity exotic, but there's also amazing individuals that have a great understanding of Christianity, like Iska Harani or Merav Mak or Salim Tamari and others, and they basically do amazing work. And when I was in the Hebrew University, we sort of did field trips in the West Bank and tried to see interesting places where Christians and Muslim interact on a religious level, which is it stands on the exact opposite pole of what we know about Christianity and Islam. And there's this fascinating place in the Al-Hadar village where there's the Orthodox Church of St. George, and St. George is venerated in Islam. In many parts of the Muslim world, is understood as being a syncretistic figure of Hadar, which is like a saintly figure mentioned in the Quran, which is basically the same with Saint George, who is a protector of the Palestinian people, but also in other countries. It's a well-known person, a well-known saint in the Christian church. So you would see, up until recently, Muslim people would go to this church on the feast of Saint George to pray to him, ask for his support, find a woman or find a man or find a job, any sort of need, any help they need with any problems. that's an interesting practice, which I was also able to see on the feast of the day. But with this religious polarization, it's one of those habits where one of those traditions that starts to fade. It's becoming more and more difficult for these things to happen. Religious pluralism has been something of the past, I think. It fades away, unfortunately. But yeah, I would say that's an interesting example of Christian and Muslim coexistence. And there's a lot of interesting discussion going on in scholarship about such sites. Is it really a coexistence? Is it a tolerance? So people don't really like them being there, but they tolerate them. Yeah, it's interesting to follow this discussion.
I have a couple of more questions before we wrap up the interview. And one is very much about you as a scholar, an anthropologist. And as you were talking about the Holy Sepulchre and the various denominations, but more importantly, the rituals and also faith, I was wondering, how is your relationship with yourself, meaning you, the anthropologist, but also you, the ordained deacon? How do you reconcile potential conflicts?
Yeah, I knew that question would come at some point. To be honest, Roberto, I'm not quite sure how to articulate this. Yeah, I'm being totally honest. I will try though. So when I was in Jerusalem, I hadn't thought about, becoming ordained or being, I was a religious person back then as well, but I wasn't thinking of that prospect back then. So if anything, the way people interacted in Jerusalem pushed me away from institutionalized religion, if I may say. From across the spectrum, in all sides, in all parts of religion I'm referring to. So yeah, I was an anthropologist until then. Now it's a different situation where I see myself as someone who was very lucky to gain a great understanding of diverse Christianity as it is played out in Jerusalem. But also I see myself as very lucky and honored by Jesus Christ to have this calling. And this is now entering a different discussion where if you hear that voice, to become like a student of Christ, it's very difficult for me, at least. It was very difficult to say no to this. It was very difficult to say I won't do it, because I heard this sort of calling in a way. I heard that. I had that feeling. So I see myself primarily as someone who has been blessed with the first sort of stage of priesthood. But I'm grateful for this great anthropological knowledge that I was able to kind of collect, and also that journey which is ongoing, of course, because I still keep learning about the situation down there, and through other work I'm currently doing as well, and trying to support the Christian communities. So yeah, it's as I said, it's still a process where I'm trying to understand how this develops.
I'm not obviously clergy. I'm a lay person, and I grew up Catholic in Italy. And I remember in time I became disassociated with, as you said, with the institutional religion, in a sense that I saw and heard things that made me feel uncomfortable with the church as an institution. And on the other hand, I start appreciating more Jerusalem from a different perspective. And I didn't feel the necessity of necessarily link every place with the story of Christianity and of Jesus, but to understand that faith is different from history in a sense, and they can coexist, but not necessarily they are the same. But as I said, this was a personal journey. I have more of a professional question now as a last one. You spend a lot of time inside the Holy Sepulchre observing people. And I wondered whether you have ever been encountering some sort of obstacles, objections to your work, difficulties where people question, what are you doing here?
All the time. I mean, think about a young person going around asking awkward questions or silly questions, like, why are you doing this? How do you see yourself? Or, just being there. in anthropology we have something called participant observation. So you participate, but you also observe, which is a bit of an oxymoron. Like, how do you participate but also observe? And that kind of movement from participating back to observing gives that unique ability, we believe, in anthropology. And anthropology says that, this is it's a movement where the ethnographer manages to see, but also detach and become so-called objective, if there's objectivity, right? So, yeah, people were all the time. First of all, a lot of people thought that I was a kind of a spy, or I was there to understand something and then provide information to somebody. Or if people see you associating with a particular group in the church, they believe that you are part of this group, so they won't open up so easily. So I had a really hard time to establish connections with Armenians or with Catholics in the beginning, because I was mostly interacting with the Greek clergy that I could communicate because of my connections and introductions from other people. So it required time to establish trust. But it's very common for anthropologists to be faced with such questions. And I think the passage of time allows for trust to be built, and then people would gradually allow you to in their sort of personal sphere, and allow you to be there when they do things. And to be honest, we're here to, as an anthropologist, I could say that for me, I was really grateful to my informants, and I would never expose them. I was just grateful for opening up their houses, their homes, their minds, and their hearts. I'm not sure if you know John Tso, the man who claimed to be Jerusalem, the famous dentist of the old city, who was also an informal historian. And now that you asked me that question, I thought of him because he's a very private person, and he doesn't, it was very difficult for me to talk to him in the beginning. He was very suspicious, why are you asking these questions and all of that. But then eventually, we established a great relationship, and then he actually went to the other end where he trusted me with a lot of information. That's where, through him, I became interested in the Greek history, the Greek, the history of the Greek community in Jerusalem, which was established in the Ottoman years, and it reached its peak in the 1948, just before the war. I mean, so yeah, that's another example of the late Dr. John Tso, who, after a while, we became really close friends.
This was George Tso, social anthropologist who had his PhD from the University of Kent. And while we await his manuscript about the relations between clergy in the Holy Sepulchre, George, thank you so much.
It was great to talk to you, Roberto. Thank you very much for this invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Jerusalem Unplugged. This podcast is currently commercial free. There are no ads. The only possibility to stay this way is for you to please let your friends, your family, and others who may be interested in listening to Jerusalem Unplugged know about this podcast. Let's increase the audience and let's keep the podcast commercial free. Thank you for listening. Until the next one.